Delightful for me to be able to be here today at MediaX to really talk about a line of research I've been doing with MediaX for 12 years now. It's really culminating and maturing in my mind, in part because of our collaboration with our industry partners, and in part because how the world has changed. We just heard Renata's great talk about how these devices are getting instantiated in industry in all sorts of different ways. And the big question I'm going to ask today is, can we predict a person's future behavior? So many of you have probably seen this cartoon before. It's an old cliche. On the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. And the big joke is that when you're online, you're anonymous. The goal of my talk today, to keep as a background, when you're using online digital devices, you have this illusion you're anonymous. But the point of today's talk, the question I'm asking is, if you have access to somebody's what I call the digital footprint, the way they use a digital device, the way they move around a room as tracked by their phone, or as tracked by a video game interface, or by a video camera, all these digital breadcrumbs that you leave behind, what can we learn about who you are, what your intentions are, what your abilities are? What can we learn about you from your digital footprint? And what I hope I can convince you of in the 20 minutes that we have is, you think that nobody knows you're a dog. But in fact, we know you're a dog. We know what kind of dog you are. We know what you've had for breakfast. And we know what fire hydrant you're going to go find to relieve yourself on. And the digital footprint is powerful. So over the years, we're not the first group of people to ask, can you predict what somebody's going to do? Sigmund Freud, perhaps one of the best known scholars here, that when we think about, if I analyze what you say, if I analyze the way you're sitting or your dreams, we can figure out things about you that are below the surface that you're not consciously aware of. And there's lots of reason to think in psychology that you can predict this. So one of my academic heroes in this area is a guy named Sandy Pentland at MIT's Media Lab. And he wrote a great book called Honest Signals, which says that humans, as we've evolved from animals, we have these nonverbal signals that we just can't hide. We just can't hide. My colleague Byron Reeves has studied for a long time the physiological footprint that people leave, and what Pentland argues is that nonverbal behavior works in the same way. I can't control my physiology. I'm nervous right now giving this talk, and I'm sweating a little bit. Likewise, some of us can control our body movements, but in general, body movements tend to be unconscious. It tends to be something we can't control. This is a quote from Pentland, who's been studying this for 30 years. Nonverbal behavior provides a, quote, unmatched window into our intentions. And Pentland works a lot with your voice. What we're going to talk about today is your body language and how nonverbal behavior can give you the same signal. Another one of our heroes in this world who just passed away is Nalini, who has come up with the term and really changed the world with her research on what's called thin slices. And what thin slices say is that humans, we like to think of ourselves as these deep creatures where you need to get to know me, and all that's wonderful and true. However, there is a lot I can tell about you from a 10-second splash, from a few second splash. And in her meta-analysis published over 20 years ago, she found that all it takes is about 2 minutes, and you can learn a lot about somebody's personality, about who they are, just from watching them from 2 minutes. A fun study that was just published 2 years ago in 2011, you can predict with extremely high coverage of variance the amount of money somebody makes at a law firm based on glancing at their college yearbook photo. So looking at partners, simply by looking at their face, you can predict how they're going to do. And again, she's and others have run dozens and dozens of studies that say not only does nonverbal behavior give you a clue into someone's identity, but you don't need all that much data. So let's go back to Sigmund Freud, who we talked about earlier. So Freud, if you were a patient of Freud, you saw him on Tuesdays between 2 and 3 p.m., and you sat on the couch, and he talked to you, and he scribbled down some notes. And that was the data he got. Maybe he got to look at your diaries. He got a tiny amount of data. And up until fairly recently, psychologists who tried to ask the question, can I predict someone's behavior from the way their body moves or other features, they haven't had a lot of data to work with. Other measures, such as neuroscience measures, they give us a wealth of data, but they're obtrusive. And what we've learned from physics is that when you measure things, you change them. It's very rare where measurement is free. If you put a camera in the room or a mirror in the room, it changes the way that I behave. Even there's some that say that electrons behave differently when there's cameras that are measuring them. We know when you measure something, it changes. And when you put a skull cap on someone or you stick them inside an MRI, you're certainly not getting natural behavior. Perhaps the person who's best known for nonverbal assimilation, looking at somebody's behavior and categorizing it nonverbally, is a gentleman named Paul Ekman, who's a brilliant scholar and very famous. He's popularized a technique of coding facial expressions that is extremely laborious. You've got to go through a video frame by frame. Each frame takes a lot of time to find certain feature points. And to code, if you wanted to code this video of me speaking right now, it would take hours and hours and hours just to code this one video. So getting nonverbal behavior has been hard to do. Because you've had to pick and choose what data you want to use, these attempts tend to be biased by theory. So we talk about top-down. So top-down, if you're trying to predict if I was a good teacher right now, you might have some theories about what makes a good teacher. Perhaps I'm confident, or I'm speaking slowly, and those are your features that you believe are going to be affecting good teaching. However, when you're collecting so much data about someone in this new digital world with all of these sensors, you don't have to be burdened by your theories. You don't have to look for features. You can collect everything and let the data sort it out, and we'll talk more about that strategy. So let me tell you what I mean by a digital footprint today. I'm going to show you a device that Haisang and I have been working on for a while using something called the Kinect, and I'm trying a demo in real time, which is always dangerous, so be kind to me if it doesn't work, but we'll try it. Okay, so this device that you're seeing right here is an old version, not even the new version, of the Microsoft Kinect. It's bathing me in infrared light. That light hits my body, bounces off of me, and hits the sensor there. We're tracking 24 points on my body, the XYZ position of each point at 30 frames a second. So that's this device right here. Does anybody know how many of these exist in the United States right now? Okay, the answer is in the tens of millions. In the tens of millions. How much does it cost? About $100. When you get it, the instructions tell you A, to plug it in, always, and B, to plug it into the internet so that you can get updates. So I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands, but I'm sure there's some of you right now that have this device plugged into your house that's also plugged into the internet. So what you are giving, and not to Microsoft. I know the folk at Microsoft, and I don't believe they're collecting this. I think they're kind and good people. But this information is traveling over the internet. Okay? Even if you don't think it is, you've got this thing plugged in. And it's constantly tracking as you walk around the room. You can tell it caught this gentleman over here while he was sitting down. You can tell that it caught him too. So literally, if it's plugged into your room, you are beaming to the world your nonverbal behavior. And the question becomes, what can we learn about people from that? There's a woman named Deborah Estrin who just moved to Cornell for the New York City Tech campus, and she likes to call this small data. I was calling it micro big data, but I'm going to adapt her term, which is small data. When we think of big data, we think of cities. We think of millions of people, but your body is a source of big data. So if you think about a conversation between two people, one person sits here, another person sits there. If they were tracked by a Kinect for 30 frames a second, let's say that it was a half-hour conversation, 24 points on the body, the XYZ position of each point, two people at 30 frames a second. In a half hour, you have over 7 million data points about how those people moved. It's a lot of data that you get to work with, and it's basically caught for free. So I want to talk about a new approach, again, which is not mine. It's a technique that's become very popular. Some call it machine learning. Some call it big data analysis. But what the way our approach works is we capture your nonverbal behavior via a sensor. We do some technique called feature selection to narrow the field of features that exist. We then build a model that can associate a body movement with an outcome. And then we feed that model the nonverbal behavior from a person it's never seen, and we ask it to predict the outcome. So let's pretend that we're trying to build an algorithm that found good teachers. Okay, so what we did is we brought in hundreds of teachers, like me now, and we tracked all of their nonverbal behavior, and then they had you guys rate me as a teacher, and you got hundreds and hundreds of teachers. You took the top 20 and the bottom 20, and then you created a model that, for the data set you have, which we call the training set, you fed it the nonverbal behaviors of the teachers, you corrected these little weights and models so that it always, when you fed in the nonverbal behavior from the training set, it could predict yes or no, was this a good or a bad teacher. Then the critical question comes, the test set. So you take someone that you have their nonverbal behavior and you have the outcome, but you haven't trained the algorithm on that person. You feed in that person's nonverbal behavior and you see if the model gets it right. So accuracy in this context is defined as does the model work on someone it's never seen before? And that's how we're going to go through some case studies now, about 5 or 6 of them, and all of them works that way. Brute force, collect a ton of data, parse your people into good and bad, high and low, create models that can differentiate them as close to perfect as possible, and then feed it someone it's never seen before and see if the model can get it right with a new person, and repeat many, many, many times. So the first case study we did, did I see Kimi over there? Yes, Kimi, you and I did this study together with our dear departed colleague Clifford Ness. This was a study we wanted to think about drivers. So can you predict if somebody's going to be a good driver or a bad driver based on how their face is moving? And so what you're seeing here, those yellow dots, you can actually get this now from the Kinect, although this algorithm doesn't require a Kinect. It can use passive computer vision just from the camera, and it's actually as good as anything that's around today, even though it's 14 years old. So the camera hits the face, we get 22 points on the face, the XY position of them at about 12 frames a second. And so what we did is we had drivers drive in a simulator. Okay, so here is one of our research assistants, Robbie Rattan. He's driving in the simulator. We've got cameras that are tracking his facial movements while he's driving, and we run hundreds and hundreds of drivers. This was a really intense, long study, hundreds of drivers. And in the driving simulators, people would have accidents. They would break laws. They would drift out of their lane. We could categorize all these events because the simulator told us when it happened. What we can then do is build models to try to detect what we call the pre-accident face, the magic facial configuration that occurs 5 seconds before somebody makes a mistake. And just to give you a sense of how powerful this technique is, other people in the field were trying to do this, but they were using top-down techniques, meaning if you were trying to do this job and you hadn't heard this talk, you would do things like, well, I'm going to look for their head to nod down, or I'm going to count how many blinks that they're doing in a 20-second range because that tells you how fatigued they are. And we didn't do that. What we did is we built these, we categorized people into good or bad drivers, or within a person into good periods or bad periods, and we just fed these models how the face was moving, and then told the model it was a good driver or a bad driver and tested it with somebody new. And our results, which even though the study is 12 years old, it took me about 9 years to figure out how to publish this work. My math skills have improved a lot, or to actually, I should be more accurate, my students have gotten better math skills because they do all the heavy lifting on this. Joris is in the room. Where's Joris? Yes, he's one of the students that has done a lot of the math on this. Thank you, Joris. We can predict far above chance if you're going to have an accident based on how your face is moving. And so our collaborators in the car industry, well, they say, well, Jeremy, you figure out if you can detect it. We'll figure out what to make the car do. And there's lots of work figuring out to do that right now. Another project that I did with Omron was, we call this Monitor Operator Fatigue. And we had people, we simulated a factory line where you're doing a very, very boring task. And we could figure out, this is about a 40-minute task. It was really hard to do. You'd get tired and you'd make mistakes. But on the factory line, a mistake can mean you lose your arm. So can we detect if somebody's about to make a mistake in a laborious task? And yes, we could, with 30% over chance, we could predict if you were about to have an accident. So if you were somebody who's building a factory line, you could detect that facial pattern that's indicative of a bad accident, and you could, you can have a mandatory coffee break, or you can play some loud music, or whatever you need to do. There's ways you can adjust this in real time. We've done similar studies with shopping. So when you're looking at a web scene, an online shopping, and we're looking at what your face does, we can have you look at a series of 20 items and track your face while looking at items that you later on bought versus ones that you later on didn't bought, and find a difference in being able to predict if you're going to buy it. and I'm going to move on and focus on the studies that I'm extremely proud of that we're doing with Konica Minolta and MediaX right now. And these ask the question, when people are working in pairs or larger groups, and again, this resonates a lot with the wonderful talk we just heard. You talked synchronicity. Can we get the synchronicity of the group? When people are working in groups, can you automatically detect when they are what we call in sync? Or can you collectively look at people's body movements and predict how well that pair is going to do? And I want to talk about two studies that we did, one with learning and one with creativity and innovation. So the first one we did is we brought in about 60 dyads, and they stood in the room right there. And each person had one of these devices, a Kinect trained on their body. And in about a 10-minute conversation, 5 to 10 minutes, one person had to learn some material in advance of the study, and then they had to present that to the second person. So one was a teacher, both were subjects. One was a teacher, one was a student. And the teacher's job was to give the student information with the goal of trying to get that student to do well. Then the student leaves and goes in another room and actually takes a test. And we score the test, and what we do is we bin people into high test scores and low test scores, and we go back and we ask the question, can the body movements of the pair predict the outcome? And I'm going to talk about some data that I've been probably talking about for a year or so, and then some that's brand new in regards to this study. So the answer is yes. In a nonlinear machine learning algorithm, you can predict with about 88% accuracy if somebody's high or low learner, especially when you define high and low as extreme. So if you cut the group right in the middle, it's really hard to predict that because people right on the border, those don't really differentiate. But if you look for the outliers, the top 10% and the bottom 10%, models are close to 90%. What we've been toiling with for the last month or two, most notably because reviewers of journal articles have asked for this, is everybody wants to know, so from the industry perspective, they just want something that predicts, and they don't care why. Right? If I can give you a product that's going to predict if a teacher is going to actually teach a student, you don't really care about the why. Academics, on the other hand, pester me for the why, and I say pester lovingly. But so we've been spending a lot of time trying to isolate the features. And one thing we discovered as we're doing this is that while you need machine learning, nonlinear, fancy math to get to this 90% level of inaccuracy, it turns out you can get a lot from looking at small amounts of features. So here are two scatter plots, and on the x-axis for each is their test score, and on the y-axis is some magic number that has to do with a feature, so don't really worry about that. Let me first talk about the graph on the left. This is the standard deviation of the teacher's head and torso. Okay? So that basically asks how much is the teacher moving back and forth during the interaction. And you can imagine that you drew a line there. You can see a nice relationship, which is the more that the teacher's moving back and forth, and this is not, there's no fancy math here. This is a scatter plot, a linear correlation. You get a statistically significant linear correlation around, it can be a 0.5 correlation in some instances, depending on which subset you look at. So just by looking how much the teacher's moving, you can see how the student's doing. So when I teach, I pace mercilessly. I can't sit still, and it's probably not a good strategy on my part. The second feature is how much the student moves. It's called skewness, which is different than standard deviation. That's over time how many extreme movements a student makes, and you can predict the more extreme movements a student makes, the less that she or he is going to learn. So machine learning is critical to get to that 90% accuracy where you want to do a product, but for academics, we can actually tell you what features are doing the work here, which is exciting. The next study that we're excited about is innovation. So here we brought in a bunch of pairs again, and they each got a similar list of information. In this instance, it was information about how to conserve water. How to conserve water. So everybody learned 15 principles about how one would conserve water. We then put them together, and we said, all right, guys, we want you to work together. We want you to come up with new ways to conserve water that no one's come up with. We want you to be creative. We want you to innovate. And so they sat there for about 5 to 10 minutes, and they innovated and came up with measures of new ways to use water. We tape recorded everything, transcribed everything, and then we came up with a measure of creativity from Dan Schwartz and his student Marilio Peso in the School of Education, where you basically count the number of new ideas and then you weight them for how novel they are, and that gives you this creativity score, which is one based on lots of previous literature. So what we got for each dyad, how creative they were. Okay, so could we predict? The answer is yes. So when you use machine learning, you can predict with fairly high accuracy whether a pair is going to be high or low creative. We can get up to this one's not as high as 90%, or we're in the mid-80s, depending on which sample you look at. But in this one, we really, working with Konica Minolta a lot on this idea, because I think this is a very fruitful future direction, this idea of nonverbal synchrony. So nonverbal synchrony is most known from a scholar named Adam Kendon, who did his work late 60s, early 70s. And nonverbal synchrony takes the idea that when people move, when they talk, it's as if they're dancing. There's this intricacy over time with how people's movements are in sync and how their voices are in sync. And my voice is in sync with my movements are in sync with your movements, and your voice is in sync with my movements, and everything pairwise. It's a very complicated dance, but no one's been able to demonstrate this in a reliable way before, because you can do hand coding of groups, but that has all the problems I talked about earlier. You can't have large samples, there's not accuracy. Or you can try to do really neat computer science ways to figure out how a group is moving, but no one's been able to do that reliably yet. So we're the first group to ever have a massive data set of lots and lots of people working together and try to come up with a top-down, not a random bottom-up model as we did to predict creativity, but if I want to have a single feature that's going to predict it, we said, why don't we try synchrony? So we tried all sorts of neat math, something called cross-lag correlation. So if you're trying to come up with a measure of correlation between my body and your body, you can think about a lot of ways to do that. So one way is you can say, well, let's see what my body's doing, and let's see what your body's doing 3 seconds later. Okay? And that's an intuitive way to start. But what if I'm the one that's following you? So you can follow me, or I can follow you. So once you start moving in time, which way you move is going to make a big difference. And so you can get some sense of the complexity of this math problem. But not only that, is you can correlate my elbow joint with your elbow joint, but maybe it's my elbow joint that correlates with your knee joint. So synchrony doesn't have to be mirroring, it can just be mere contingency. So you can get a sense of this math problem, and we spent about 4 or 5 months really just beating up this data in a really fun way, and we continue to do so. But we ended up just doing is, let's stop trying to be so fancy, and let's just correlate people's movements from joint to joint at time 0. So in other words, if I'm doing this, let's see if you're doing this at the exact same time. And so that's basically what we did, is a correlation score of joints at time 0. There's no movement. So if I'm doing this right now, are you doing it? And what I'm going to show you here is a scatter plot for people's heads. Okay, so this on the y-axis is what we call synchrony score, and that's how much our heads are correlating in terms of their movement. On the x-axis is how creative the pair is. This is a significant relationship at about 0.4, and the correlation in our head movements is synchrony of where we're looking, how our heads are moving on pitch, yaw, and roll, can predict how creative you are. So again, with machine learning, with these nonlinear algorithms, we can get to very high accuracies, mid-80s, but I can just predict if you guys are high or low in creativity simply by looking if your heads are moving together. The next step, we're going to do this with brains, right? Great. Okay, so I do want to conclude. So the applications here are wonderful. There's so many great applications, and I'm really behind them. So whether it ranges from calming technologies that we're going to work together on and have people be more physiologically healthy, exercise, there's so many good things. On the other hand, so let me give you an example from the car company. So we built these car algorithms to detect whether or not somebody's face predicts if they're going to have an accident. What we discovered along the way is, it turns out, so it's a really useful algorithm if you're trying to predict within a person if she's tired or not, so that you can warn her not to have a car accident. But what if there's a certain pattern of facial movement that overall predicts how good a driver someone is? In other words, what we found is I could predict if you were a good driver or a bad driver simply based on how you move your face. Okay, so I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands, but how many of you think insurance companies should have a right to that data? Well, I want to be safe on the roads. If we can get 10 crazy drivers not to drive because we've detected how their face works, then let's keep them off the roads. On the other hand, I don't want them having my face data, right? So all of these have wonderful, wonderful applications. On the other hand, this is our data. I go back to the Kinect example. The instructions say plug it in to the wall, plug it into the internet so you get updates. And, is it great to do it? I don't know. This is people get really pissed off when you're using Angry Birds, when the CIA is using it to try to prevent bad people from coming in. So anyway, something to think about. I don't know if we're doing questions or not, but happy to do questions for a couple minutes. Yeah.